Hello and welcome to another episode of Shadow Talk. I'm your host, Michael Marriott. In this week's episode, a rude awakening for smart TV users, Satori, son of Mirai, targets yet more insecure devices. But what on earth will it be used for? The Middle Eastern espionage campaign OilRig adopts new PowerShell techniques. We dive into PowerShell security risks in general and provide some tips. And following news from the US surge around the Russian threat to critical power systems, we look to put the energetic bear campaign into perspective. All this and much more in this week's Shadow Talk. Hello listeners, welcome to another episode. Joining me today, we've got the reliable Dr. Richard Gold. Hello, Rich.
Hi, Mike.
And we've got Rose Bernard, the Strategic Research Manager at Digital Shadows. Rose, how are you doing? It's been a little while.
It has. I'm pleased to be back.
How upset are we feeling about the lovely weather in England? I'm sad to be missing it, but as Rich told me yesterday, it's like living in soup.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really upset about it because the heat has actually drained all capacity for emotional involvement out of me. So unless kind of like I just roll into a swimming pool, there's no hope.
Yeah, well, could be worse.
Be specific. Show you're working.
I guess we should probably talk about cybersecurity things. A few stories that we're going to cover this week, but let's start off with news about the Satori Botnet, which has been targeting some new devices, taking advantage of some open ports. Now, it might be good to just remind ourselves about the Satori Botnet. We first mentioned it on the pod about 7 months ago when the source code was publicly released. But Rose, perhaps you want to talk listeners through what exactly the Satori Botnet is.
Yeah, so Satori, which incidentally is the Japanese word for awakening, which is quite fascinating, but it is a botnet that kind of derives from the Mirai malware. And when it was first observed, it targeted these two exploits in order to infect devices on some open ports. So it was essentially a worm because it self-propagated through these networks. It targeted mostly Internet of Things devices or Internet of Things connected devices, which are predominantly compromised through brute force attacks. But it differed to other Mirai variants because it kind of identified additional targets and kept this self-propagation. So it targeted, when we first saw it, these two exploits, CVE 2014-8361 and CVE 2017-17215, I think, if memory serves.
How could you possibly forget such catchy names?
I know. Shame on me. And it was essentially in December 2017, there was this massive coming together of ISPs and cybersecurity companies who were trying to take down these command and control domains used by Satori. But in the 22nd of December, it still had between about 500,000 and 700,000 bots. In January, we saw it again, and there were three main variants. In June, we had a attack potential attribution that kind of linked Satori to DDoS attacks. So this is the 15th of June, 2018. It was a very, very tentative link. We haven't had anything confirming it yet, but it could indicate that whoever is behind this botnet, whichever threat actors, are now kind of gearing up to this sort of malicious activity.
The update this week has been it's targeting TCP port 5555 and specifically about just Internet of Things like smart TVs and Android devices and things like that. So it's potentially got the whack added of all of these devices as well.
Yeah, so there's a command line utility called the Android debug bridge, which is part of the Android module, which kind of communicates between Android devices and developers who run and debug apps. And security researchers identified a new campaign that was using this to target port 5555 on Internet of Things vulnerable devices. And what happened was they looked at the command and control server and found that this was linked to the Satori variant of the Satori botnet, because it used the same CTF server and there were overlapping TTPs like the XOR method to encrypt strings. And this kind of it's likely to indicate that the Satori botnet is now branching out into connecting other devices using ADB as another way to expand its reach. Again, we've seen no malicious activity related to it. That doesn't mean it isn't capable of it. It just means it hasn't done it yet. It's lying in wait.
Yeah, but the potential, if these were incorporated into the botnet, I mean, what could you do with the botnet that is comprised of those sort of devices? Is that predominantly denial of service attacks, or are there any other types of things that they could be used for?
So it's very similar things. So it is denial of service attacks. It's brute force cracking activity. You could use it to distribute malware. You could use it to distribute spam mail. It's essentially about a botnet finding another way to expand its reach.
I think just the interesting thing was just to mention that it's not an exploit, right? There's no sort of memory corruption or anything being used. It's just people have left something which allows you to upload code into a device exposed to the internet. So, don't do that. Pro tip.
Okay. Well, we'll certainly keep an eye out on that and see whether any attacks materialise. Yeah, just want to keep an eye on it at the moment. I think one other thing in the news this week is the more news on the OilRig campaign. OilRig espionage actor in the Middle East. Anything more on that actor, and then we'll dive into the updates this week.
So we actually had two campaigns focusing on Iran reported this week, which I quite like, because Iran is often like it's kind of the third Hemsworth brother in nation state activity. You it's there, and it's kind of trying to do its own thing, and it's kind of trying to reach the fame of its siblings, say Russia and China, but it's getting there. It's in progress. And to have two reports in the same week is quite interesting. So the update we had on OilRig was that it had been seen again targeting the Middle East region, which is quite typical for it, but it used a PowerShell backdoor payload called Quad Agent, which is a new TTP for the group. It also used an open source tool to obscure code within Quad Agent, and they're kind of doing the very similar thing that they've always done. So they are consistently operating in the Middle East region. They consistently use relatively simple attack techniques, but they're now evolving this to attempt to avoid detection, which is quite an interesting developing awareness of their operating environment.
Yeah, I think the PowerShell element is very significant. Probably one of our most popular blogs that we've done is risks around PowerShell. Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether Rich has any thoughts on this particular area.
So PowerShell is pretty much the go-to attacker TTP these days for these groups which are interested in network intrusions. So it was something that was very popular amongst sort of commercial pen testers, red teams, for a good few years now, and has recently been part of more commodity threats. The advantage of PowerShell is that it's installed by default on Windows machines. So you have access to a large range of built-in features that you can use for your attacks. And there are many sort of commercial and non-commercial off-the-shelf systems you can use: PowerShell Empire, Cobalt Strike, which incorporate PowerShell. And we've seen many threat actors take advantage of them. Indeed, there's a threat group called Cobalt because they use Cobalt Strike, which is a legitimate red team tool. It's very powerful, as I mentioned. And with the older version of PowerShell, so version 2, there's a lot you can do without really getting caught. The logging is not so detailed as it is with version 5. So version 5, which is available on Windows 10, really gives the network defenders a lot of valuable information about what PowerShell scripts are running, what it's trying to do, if downgrade attacks are trying to be performed. So that's something which is very useful. Unfortunately, many organizations haven't upgraded to the latest and greatest. So PowerShell 2 is still very much present in many organizations, and so attackers are really having a field day with all of the great features which PowerShell provides to offensive operations.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, and that piece of advice with version 5 is mentioned in our blog and alongside a bunch of other advice from the security engineering team. So do check that out. Now, I want to spend probably the majority of the rest of the time talking about the latest story, and that's news of more activity targeting energy companies, or do we want to call it Dragonfly APT or Energetic Bear? Does anybody care?
Dragonfly or Crouching Yeti. Don't forget Yetis.
Nobody puts the Yeti in the corner. So who wants to talk us through exactly what's been going on and the historic reporting around this and why exactly it's cropping up now?
I can start with a bit of background on this one. So this threat actor has been interested in power companies for a while now, and it's interesting for a number of reasons. One of the things is, of course, the targeting. Why would you want to compromise a power company? What possible reason could you have for that? And that's one thing. And then the tradecraft that they use in terms of how to operate inside of an industrial control network is also pretty interesting. Now, they've also been quite creative in their usage of TTPs to gain initial access into the organizations. A lot of it has been around supply chain, trusted relationships, these kind of things. So they deliberately seek out supplier organizations for the power grid industry, and they look for ones which are weakly defended. Maybe they don't have the security budget as some of the main organizations in the field do, and they compromise these supply organizations, and they leverage then the trusted relationship between the supplier and the target to jump from one organization to another. Now, we saw this also even with the GRU indictment that we were talking about recently, when the attackers compromised one organization and used that access to bounce into another. So it's a pretty effective and powerful TTP. And not only is it effective, it's also very, very difficult to defend against. So that's a real challenge for organizations to keep an eye on their supply chain, keep an eye on who has a trusted relationship into their environment. Now, the attackers were using, the standard TTP, spear phishing, watering hole to gain that initial access. And once they're inside, one of the interesting things was that they were able, apparently, to jump between the IT network and then the control network. And control network being where the actual ICS equipment would be housed. Now, it's important to kind of see the broader context of these things. So yes, they were able to get onto the control network, and being on the control network theoretically gives you the ability to shut off the power. And a lot of people have referenced the black energy attacks against Ukraine as example of a cyber intrusion, which was then translated into some kind of real world impact. Now, the Ukraine power grid and the US power grid are, of course, very, very different. It's worth keeping in mind that there is an enormous amount of monitoring that goes on with these safety critical industries. So even if you are able to take out the power by opening a relay, which is what happened during the black energy attack, to really build that into something which takes out the grid for any decent amount of time, that's actually very, very difficult. Now, Robert M. Lee, who works for JGOS, writes very, very well on this subject. He's extremely knowledgeable, has a lot of great experience, and I think it's really worth paying attention to that issue where just because you got on, even to the control network, doesn't mean you can make that translate to a large-scale power outage.
So perhaps no Armageddon that is imminent, but there must be a reason.
Not even Cybergeddon. I think one thing to keep in mind is the reporting talks about the extensive amount of reconnaissance that the attackers did before intruding into these environments. As I mentioned, the Ukrainian power grid is very different to the American power grid, which is then, of course, different to Western European power grid and so on. So different protocols, different technologies, different structure, the works, different regulatory environment, everything. And clearly the attackers needed to learn about this environment. They had to really put a lot of time and effort into getting to know their target environment. So they, according to the reporting, were stealing confidential information, which would detail the network structure, the network diagrams, the network architecture of these organizations, which equipment was being used. And then, of course, they could use this to do their own research for how to take advantage of these things, whether that's through some kind of feature abuse or stolen credentials or whatever. So once again, like we saw in the GRU indictment, that the attackers are really putting the effort into learning about their target environment. They're not just jumping in and hoping for the best. They're carefully preparing. And often it's tempting to rely on security through obscurity exclusively. That is, assuming that your environment is so arcane, is so baroque, and so obscure that attackers won't know what to do with it. But these attackers were really invested in their goal. They were really motivated, really committed. And they clearly spent a lot of time familiarizing themselves with all of the details about these power grid environments that they were breaking into. And this is a pattern that we also saw, as I mentioned, with the GRU indictment, and as we discussed a couple of weeks back, the leaked Carbonac, not Carbonac source code. Those attackers also spending a lot of time getting to know the environments that they were operating in. So it's worth paying close attention to what information is available to attackers about what you're running and how can that be taken advantage of.
All right. Thank you very much, Rich. And thank you to both of you for joining this week's pod, and thank you at home for listening. To check out that blog on PowerShell security, do visit our website at digitalshadows.com.